With the end of Sigrika's story in 3.2, we got to see a story of a girl burdened with pressures and expectations, alongside the consequences of such, manifesting within the disastrous dark side. However, one thing you may have missed is the symbolism and references that influence Sigrika's story and design language, which is what I want to peel back the layers of today. So if you are perhaps curious about how this seemingly aloof girl links to Norse mythology, Valkyries, Mozart of all people, and perhaps even Richard Wagner's Das Ring der Nibelungen, make sure to be careful of the spoilers ahead for the 3.2 story, and let's start peeling back the figurative layers behind Sigrika's design. As is usual when I delve into resonant analyses, the first thing we have to look at is Sigrika's name. Considering that Sigrika's Chinese name doesn't seem to have much more than just a transliteration, I think it's safe to say that, like a lot of Royan history and culture that we've covered in previous videos, Norse mythology is what underpins her etymology. Sigrika, if we are to directly translate her name, is something that has three parts to it. Firstly, Sig is a common word in Old Norse to denote victory, and is going to be a bit of an important recurring idea throughout the whole video. For instance, one of the reasons why we know Sig means victory in Old Norse is because of the Sigrdrifr from the Poetic Edda, something we'll be talking about later in this video. Besides that, Rika is very similar to Rika, an Old Norse word to denote a ruler, or someone who is powerful or royal. We know this because this was a common term that evolved to form names like Erik, coming from Eirika, which means single or sole ruler. However, one thing you may be asking is why Sigrika's Rika ends with an A rather than usual R. This is where the last etymological component comes in, as ka, which in a lot of Slavic languages is actually a phrase you add at the end of words to denote something as being little, young, or junior. So when you put everything together, Sigrika sort of means a young, victorious ruler, which is actually quite befitting her almost royal position as a future member of the Heliotic Six and a reader of Royan runes. Sigrika's narrative, which focuses heavily on her pressures and expectations of those around her, of course, ties into this. Even her very name itself shows just how significant the duties and responsibilities as a young ruler that brings victory to her people actually is. The other part of resonant analyses I usually do is the specific story, movie, or other text that is the inspiration for a lot of the characters' design language. Characters like Cardathia, Frolova, and Ameth all have such texts, and quite interestingly, Sigrika is also no exception. Once you finish Sigrika's story in 3.2, you will get the quite interesting achievement Wir wird man seinen Schatten los, which is German for, how do you get rid of your shadow? This is a reference to both a song and a lyric from said song, from the 1999 musical Mozart, which reimagines the life of the famous Wolfgang Mozart, who I'm sure you've heard of at least once before. Mozart was well known as a child prodigy, which is something that was seen from an early age from his father that trained him. The 1999 musical reimagines this, framing Mozart as a tragic hero that was doomed by pressures and expectations, from his father, from society, even from himself. You can probably already see how Sigrika ties into this, being seen by everybody around her as a prodigy, placing an immense weight on her shoulders that is so strong and it manifests as a core of the dark side. However, the more important part that we need to focus on within the 1999 musical is the presence of an alter ego, a shadow of Mozart, taking the form of an emotionless child version of himself, called Amade. Amade is a manifestation of Mozart's negative emotions, his pressures that push him to succeed in composing music at whatever the cost. Eventually, this shadow of Mozart is what pushes him to his death. Sigrika's story mirrors this beautifully. Not only is she a parallel of Mozart, being a prescient child prodigy, but within the story she also possesses a shadow, alter ego of herself, formed from her negative emotions and being so powerful it functions as a vortex of the dark side, being quite literally the voice in her head, as well as taking on a physical form at the end of the story, just like Mozart's persona Amade. Shadow Sigrika very, very nearly brings her to ruin. It's on the cusp of the story being a tragedy like Mozart's that Sigrika brings herself together to avoid such a fate. As we said before, the achievement name at the end of Sigrika's story, which allows us to form this connection between Sigrika's story and the 1999 musical in the first place, is also the name of a song within it. This song, titled Wie wird man seinen Schatten los, quite appropriately has lyrics which are a near-perfect match to Sigrika's story. I renounce the Princess Grace, and the powder locks as well, is a reference to his shadow, to Mozart's Amade persona. Within the first stanza, Mozart resigns that he is willing to give up all his achievements if only he could live life. Within the second stanza, the infamous line appears. The rest of the stanza as well, I think, is just an amazing link to Sigrika's story, about the pressures and constant voice of her alter ego that haunt her. Going further down, we observe, near you stands a demon in the shape of a boy. A clear reference again to this shadow alter ego, which in this case is Mozart's Amade. The last stanza is perhaps the most haunting, as Mozart wonders if he can ever run from the fate that his shadow and others place on him. As you can see, there is an excellent reason why Kuro chose this song to be the reference at the very end of Sigrika's story. It summarizes and parallels it perfectly. However, this is not the only song in the musical that is referenced within the quest. Within the song Gold von der Sternen, Mozart and his father are metaphorically cast as a king and a prince, kept safe within the walls of a castle. However, Mozart's ambition to break out of this cage is represented through the lyrics as gold falling from the stars. Sigrika's world, being entombed within her responsibilities as a Heliotic 6 member, is tragically similar. In fact, within the story, she makes quite a reference to this song as well. The answer to the final riddle of the story, the final solution to the entire dilemma that the story has presented, is gold flecked with starlight. And why do you think the quest is called Gold Suspended in Shadow? Well, Sigrika, like the rest of the Roy inside of Lahai, is heavily attuned to real-life Norse mythology. We've already gotten references to Balder, Loki, Ragnarok, Yggdrasil, Jormungandr, and more, so it's fitting that the Hallmark Roy Resonator is also linked to something. In particular, I believe that when we look at the Lore of Norroyans and then Sigrika, she epitomizes the role of the Valkyrie within the Norse world. I'm sure you've heard of Valkyries before, but you may not know specifically what they are. Valkyries are female warriors with mystical powers that serve the Norse gods, such as Odin and Balder, whose job is to roam battlefields searching for the fallen and slain. These fallen warriors would then be guided by the Valkyries to Valhalla, where they would feast and prepare for Ragnarok, the end of the world. Besides the fact that Ragnarok has been heavily hinted at throughout the Lahairo story, being what the Norroyans believe will be the final battle between the Exostrider and the Frenodian Eleth-1, or Varunga, there is also quite a parallel within Norroyan tradition that matches the Valkyries. Similar to how real Valkyries bring the souls of warriors to their god to prepare for Ragnarok, the Norroyans also bring the Solar Skin and Exoswarm back to the Exostrider to help it recover, to prepare for the final battle. This is the 1,000-year promise that the Norroyans have shared with the Exostrider, in exchange for it sacrificing its heart in order to save them. Amongst this Norroyan tradition, it's actually pretty clear that Sigrika has tie-ins to Norse Valkyries. Not only does she have a face mask within her moveset and story, which already makes her look like a Valkyrie, her relationship with the Solar Skin, her job to guide them back to the Exostrider, is, as we said before, a great parallel to what real Valkyries did. The Solar Skin are guided back to Exostrider to prepare for its awakening, readying for final battle between it and the Frenodian. Beyond this, you may be also wondering how Sigrika's runes, which is all over her character, moveset and story, ties into real Norse runes. While Norse runes from the Younger and Elder Futhark are not similar to the runes shown in game, the real runes within Norse mythology are very powerful, like their in-game counterparts. Real-life runes were a product of nature itself, a writing form that was composed of a natural power. It is said that Odin hung from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 nights to learn about the power of runes. As Odin's servants, Valkyries often also understood and used runes, acting as a sort of enchantment to provide protection or even bring on victory. As runic power was a natural force almost like magic, carving them into surfaces was believed to provide power. Many such runes were carved to form the name of the gods, and because runes were a sort of worldly power, it was thought that the true names of the gods were in the form of runes. This is why Sigrika, being a sort of Valkyrie, both is an expert in runes as well as referencing true names several times within her moveset. This whole idea of runes and Valkyries, however, will go even deeper, something we'll explore in the next chapter. While we've analyzed the importance of Sigrika's name already, there's actually one other way to understand it, now that we've gone through the connection of Valkyries and runes to Sigrika's character. I think it is likely, at least the extent that it's worth talking about, that Sigrika's name is based, possibly, on the real Norse figure of Sigrdrifr, whose name differs from Sigrika by only one word, being rider instead of ruler. Sigrdrifr appears within the Poetic Edda, probably the single most important source for Norse mythology, in a section called the Sigrdrifrmál, which just means the words of Sigrdrifr. It will probably be rather unsurprising that Sigrdrifr is a Valkyrie, one that was cursed to eternal sleep because she killed Jarl Gunnar, a king that Odin promised would win a battle. Because Sigrdrifr essentially defied the fate decreed by the gods, she was pricked by a thorn that doomed her to eternal sleep. This was until she was awoken by the hero Sigurd, and in exchange for awakening her, gave him critical advice and, more importantly, taught him how to interpret runes. Now, beyond the fact that Sigrika also seems to play this role, reading the runes and being a guide for the story's hero, we can extrapolate this just a little bit more. Now, this is where we get into territory which is a bit too subjective for some of my liking, so take this all with a grain of salt. As we discussed, Sigrdrifr was doomed to eternal sleep because she defied Odin. As a result, in legends, Sigrdrifr is often seen as a doomed Valkyrie, who defied fate and gods and was punished as a result. If you've been watching my previous videos, you'll be more than aware that these ideas are massively common themes within Wuthering Waves. Sigrika is almost prophetically doomed to fail, set up by the Grand Architect in Navora to succumb to an eternal sleep within the dark side, which wants what exactly? To make anyone who enters to let go, to forget, to fall into an eternal slumber. However, it is the hero of the story that awakens her from this delusion, and as a result, she guides and helps him in exchange. It may not be correct, but it is interesting to think about, especially because our discussion on Sigrdrifr is not exactly over. Now, this is going to be a more skeptical reference, so as always, form your own opinion and keep an open mind. Within my look video, one of the last things I talked about was the particularly interesting links between looks of a symbolism, like alchemy, gold, and Norse mythology, and how that may all link to Richard Wagner's incredibly famous 4-part drama, Das Ring des Nibelungen, especially the first part, Das Rheingold. Now, the thing is, I wasn't really counting on Sigrika referencing this drama again, but one of the things I found particularly interesting is that Sigrika continues Look's trend of constantly, like it's actually crazy, constantly referencing gold, especially molten gold. In Look's video, we talked about how in Wagner's play, molten gold is an incredibly important part of it, being the molten Rheingold that both is incredibly valuable but curses its owner to misfortune. Within Look's story, this gold came up as ichor, the incredibly dangerous wonder drug that gave him incredible powers, but was also incredibly dangerous. Within Sigrika's story, this gold is the expectations others place in her, which we know exactly because Kuro just had to give us a label in a dialogue line. While this is something that curses her existence, it is also something that gives her hope to push forward, as we swap her with our previous discussion on Sigrika's answer to a final riddle, gold specked with starlight. But there's also a little bit more. While Look's story focuses on the first part of Wagner's drama, Das Rheingold, the second part of the play also begs some attention. It is called Die Walkure, or the Valkyrie. It tells a story of Brunhilde, the German name for Sigrdrifr, and her awakening by Siegfried, the German name for Sigurd. I find it very interesting all in all, considering all we've talked about already with Sigrdrifr. However, that goes a little bit beyond the scope of Sigrika herself. In the next video, I actually plan to look at Richard Wagner's play in a wider perspective, on the level of the whole of the High Road story, so I'll be saving just a little bit of stuff for that. But with Sigrika's almost uncannily excessive references to gold, and a nice coincidence of the second part of Wagner's drama being focused on Valkyries and Sigrdrifr, it really begs an interesting question for not only what could have been the possible interpretations for Sigrika's story, but also what role she may play in the future of it. And with that, we have reached the end. Thank you all very much for watching the video, and as always, if you want to support me, feel free to subscribe, even become a channel member, or donate through the comments if you feel it. Channel members will now have access to a channel on my Discord, where I'll be posting some early access stuff as a little thanks for all of your support. I'll be working on the next video, which will focus on Richard Wagner's drama, and have a little bit of theory crafting, if you will. So I hope you all have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you all in the next one.